What if the wisdom of 1,000 years simply vanished? What if entire libraries holding secrets and stories from the medieval world were swallowed by flames or swept away by the tides of war? What if we could peek behind the veil of history and uncover these lost wonders, these colossal monuments to knowledge from the medieval world? Number 10. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad. Imagine a city humming with intellectual fervor, a place where scholars from across the known world gathered to translate, discuss, and create. This was Baghdad in the 9th century, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, and at its core stood the legendary House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah. This institution was not just a library. It was a grand academy, a research center, and a translation powerhouse all rolled into one. It flourished under the patronage of caliphs like Harun al-Rashid, and especially his son, al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833 CE. Al-Ma'mun was obsessed with knowledge, reportedly offering the weight of a book in gold to scholars who would bring ancient text to Baghdad for translation. The House of Wisdom was more than a storage facility for scrolls and codices. It was a bustling workshop of intellect. Scribes meticulously copied manuscripts. Translators worked tirelessly to render Greek, Syriac, Pahlavi, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic, and original research was conducted in fields ranging from astronomy and mathematics. Picture the vast halls, filled with the murmur of voices, the scratching of reeds on parchment, the rustle of pages being turned. Scholars like Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose work on algebra gave us the very word algorithm, conducted their groundbreaking studies here. His treatise, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, was a foundational text for centuries. Another giant was the physician and philosopher Abu Bakr al-Razi, who wrote hundreds of books and articles, including his famous medical encyclopedia Kitab al-Hawi, which compiled knowledge from Greek, Indian, and Islamic sources. The library was meticulously organized, a testament to the advanced administrative skills of the Abbasid Empire. Scrolls and later bound books were categorized by subject, making it easier for scholars to access the information they needed. It was a true melting pot of ideas where different intellectual traditions met and fused. Discoveries in astronomy, such as the accurate calculation of the Earth's circumference by al-Ma'mun's astronomers, were made possible by the clamberty environment and the vast resources available. They even built an observatory part of the House of Wisdom's scientific endeavors, where celestial movements were precisely charted. The city of Baghdad itself, with its circular design and thriving markets, reflected the systematic approach to knowledge that characterized the House of Wisdom. The sheer volume of texts was staggering. It wasn't just classical Greek philosophy that was preserved and expanded upon. Indian mathematics, Persian literature, and ancient Mesopotamian wisdom also found a home and new life within its walls. Translators working there were not just linguistic conduits. They were often scholars in their own right, adding commentaries and clarifying complex ideas for their Arabic-speaking audience. This process was vital for the transmission of knowledge that later influenced the European Renaissance. Imagine the thrill of holding a freshly translated text of Aristotle or Ptolemy, opening up entirely new worlds of thought. This incredible beacon of knowledge faced a cataclysmic end. In 1258, the Mongol armies, led by Hulagu Khan, swept into Baghdad. The siege was brutal and the city fell. For days, the city was plundered and destroyed. Accounts from historians of the time, like the Persian chronicler Atamalik Shuvani, describe the horror. The House of Wisdom, along with countless other libraries and institutions, was systematically ravaged. Books were reportedly thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the river ran black with ink for days, or red with the blood of slaughtered scholars. The valuable bindings and parchment were ripped apart. The loss was immeasurable. Centuries of intellectual progress, The painstaking work of countless scholars, translators, and scribes vanished in a terrifying instant. Works that might have provided deeper insights into ancient cultures or propelled scientific advancements further were simply gone. The destruction of the House of Wisdom represented a turning point, a devastating blow to the intellectual heart of the Islamic Golden Age. The vibrant scholarly community dispersed, and many texts were lost forever, leaving behind only fragmented references in other surviving works. Visiting this magnificent hub of learning before its tragic end would have been an experience unparalleled in the medieval world. Number 9. The Dharma Gunj at Nalanda, India. Far to the east, in what is now Bihar, India, stood another colossus of learning, the ancient Buddhist monastery and University of Nalanda. While its origins stretched back to the 5th century CE, its greatest glory unfolded throughout the medieval period, from the 7th to the 12th centuries. Nalanda was not merely a monastic retreat. It was an international center of higher education, attracting students and scholars from across Asia, including Tibet, China, Korea, and Central Asia. Think of it as a sprawling campus, not just a library building, but a collection of temples, viharas or monasteries, classrooms, meditation halls, and of course, magnificent libraries. The libraries at Nalanda were legendary. They were housed in 3 massive multi-storied buildings, known collectively as Dharma Gunj, the Mountain of Truth. The names of these buildings themselves evoked their grandeur. Ratna Sagra, Ocean of Jewels; Ratnodadi, Sea of Jewels; and Ratnaranjaka, Jewel Adorned. Ratnodadi was said to be 9 stories high, containing the most sacred of Buddhist scriptures, including the Prajnaparamita Sutra and the Samajiraja Sutra, along with vast collections on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and the arts. Imagine towering structures filled floor to ceiling with palm leaf manuscripts and birch bark scrolls, meticulously copied and preserved. Nalanda was a hub of intellectual activity. Students underwent rigorous training, mastering not only Buddhist doctrines, but also a wide range of secular subjects. Curriculum included the Vedas, logic, epistemology, grammar, medicine, metaphysics, philosophy, and the arts. Scholars like Nagarjuna, Aryabhata, and Dharmakirti, though some predated or were contemporary with Nalanda's peak, influenced the intellectual environment that produced later masters like Shanta Rakshita and Atisha Dipankara Srinana, who were instrumental in the spread of Buddhism to Tibet. The university had a strict admission process, and only the most dedicated students were accepted. The Dharma Gunj wasn't just a repository, it was a living, breathing part of the university's intellectual life. Scholars would engage in debates, write commentaries, and produce new works based on the immense knowledge stored within its walls. The texts included not only religious scriptures but also secular sciences, demonstrating a holistic approach to education. The sheer scale of the library and its diverse collection meant that countless schools of thought were represented, fostering a dynamic environment of inquiry and discourse. The university itself was supported by numerous patrons, including kings and merchants who understood the value of such a center of learning. The architecture of Nalanda was also awe-inspiring. Red brick structures, adorned with intricate carvings and statues, rose majestically from the plains. Courtyards echoed with the chants of monks and the debates of scholars. The library buildings, especially Ratnodadi with its 9 stories, would have been a sight to behold, a testament to the commitment to preserving and disseminating knowledge. The texts themselves were often beautiful works of art, carefully handwritten by scribes on treated palm leaves or birch bark, with exquisite illustrations and decorative bindings. However, like so many other centers of learning, Nalanda suffered a catastrophic fate. Around 1193 CE, The invading army of Muhammad Bakhtiar Khalji, a general of the Ghurid Empire, attacked and sacked the university. Historical accounts, particularly from the Persian historian Mingad Siraj Juzjani, in his Tabaqat-i-Nasiri, describe the devastating destruction. The libraries were set ablaze, and the fire is said to have burned for months, consuming countless priceless manuscripts. Thousands of monks and scholars were massacred. The loss was immense. Entire bodies of knowledge, especially unique Buddhist texts that had not been copied elsewhere, vanished in the inferno. Many of the texts that define specific schools of Buddhist thought, as well as crucial scientific and philosophical treatises, were irrecoverably lost. While some texts had been taken to Tibet or other parts of Asia by escaping scholars, the vast majority of Nalanda's intellectual heritage was annihilated. The destruction of Nalanda marked a significant decline in Buddhism in India and a profound loss for global intellectual history. A visit to the Dharma Gunj before its tragic end would have been an immersion in an unparalleled ocean of ancient wisdom. Number 8. The Imperial Library of Constantinople, Byzantine Empire. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as the bastion of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. And at the heart of its intellectual life was the Imperial Library, a vast collection that served as a direct link to the glories of classical antiquity. Its roots stretched back to the 4th century CE, established by Emperor Constantius II, who sought to preserve the literary heritage of Greece and Rome. This library was not just a symbol of imperial power, it was a living testament to the Byzantine commitment to preserving ancient knowledge, especially the works of Greek authors. The library was constantly expanded and meticulously maintained. Scribes, often monks, diligently copied and recopying ancient texts, preserving them from the ravages of time and decay. Parchment, a more durable material than papyrus, became the standard for these precious copies, ensuring their longevity. Picture a grand hall, possibly within the imperial palace complex, filled with shelves holding thousands upon thousands of scrolls and later codices. The air would have carried the scent of old parchment and ink, a silent symphony of centuries of human thought. The collection was truly encyclopedic. It housed the complete works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. Roman authors also featured prominently, though the emphasis was largely on Greek literature and philosophy. Beyond the classics, the library contained Christian theological texts, legal codes, scientific treatises by figures like Galen and Ptolemy, and historical chronicles of the Byzantine Empire itself. The sheer volume and diversity of its holdings made it one of the largest and most important libraries in the medieval world. The scholars of Constantinople, known as Hellenists, devoted their lives to studying, commenting on, and teaching these ancient texts. They were guardians of a flame that had flickered in the West after the fall of Rome. Their work included producing scholarly editions of texts, complete with annotations and commentaries which were vital for understanding the nuances of ancient Greek. The library was a resource for the entire Byzantine intellectual class, from imperial officials who studied Roman law to theologians grappling with complex doctrines. Imagine sitting in a quiet corner, poring over a manuscript of Plato, perhaps one that had been copied directly from an ancient papyrus. The history of the Imperial Library was marked by periods of both grandeur and devastating loss. It suffered partial destruction on several occasions, including fires in 473 CE and 1204 CE. The fire of 473, during the reign of Emperor Zeno, was particularly catastrophic, reputedly consuming 120,000 volumes, including a unique copy of the Iliad and Odyssey written on a serpent's intestine, over 100 feet long. Despite these setbacks, the Byzantines consistently rebuilt and replenished their collection, demonstrating an unwavering dedication to intellectual preservation. They even developed techniques for erasing and reusing parchment, creating palimpsests, which sometimes inadvertently preserved older texts underneath newer ones. The most severe blow came in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade. Crusaders, originally tasked with liberating the Holy Land, instead turned their attention to Constantinople. The city was brutally sacked. Churches were desecrated, palaces plundered, and the imperial library, a treasure trove of classical knowledge, was ravaged. Many manuscripts were destroyed in fires. Others were stolen and dispersed across Western Europe, some ending up in the libraries of newly formed Western kingdoms or private collections. Crusaders, more interested in gold and plunder than ancient wisdom, did not understand the immense cultural value of what they were destroying. The final demise of the imperial library occurred in 1453 with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. While some texts had been spirited away by scholars fleeing the city in the years leading up to the siege, and Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, had an interest in ancient knowledge, many remaining volumes were likely lost in the chaos of the city's fall. The grand collection, which had preserved so much of ancient Greece, was dispersed and largely ceased to exist as a unified entity. Its remnants are now scattered in libraries across the globe. To have walked through its halls before the Crusaders' torches, to have seen its vast collection of ancient wisdom, would have been a profoundly humbling experience, a direct connection to the very roots of Western civilization. Number 7. The libraries of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. In the medieval period, while much of Europe languished in what is sometimes called the Dark Ages, a beacon of learning shone brightly in the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Andalus. This was the Muslim-ruled territory, in what is now Spain and Portugal, a vibrant crossroads of cultures where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived and often collaborated, fostering an intellectual golden age. The city of Cordoba, in particular, became one of the largest and most advanced cities in Europe, a center of unparalleled scholarship, boasting not just one grand library, but hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of private and public collections. The Great Library of Cordoba, founded by Caliph al-Hakam II, who reigned from 961 to 976 CE, was the crown jewel. Al-Hakam II was an avid bibliophile and scholar, and he spared no expense in acquiring books. He sent agents across the Islamic world to Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, to purchase rare manuscripts or commission copies. His library was said to have contained 400,000 to 600,000 volumes, an astronomical number for the time. This was far beyond any collection in contemporary Christian Europe. To put it in perspective, the largest Christian library in Europe at the time probably held a few thousand volumes. Al-Hakam II's library was a testament to the sophistication of Islamic scholarship. It was meticulously catalogued, with a 44-volume index detailing the titles. Imagine thousands of scribes and binders working tirelessly producing beautiful copies of texts. The library included not only Islamic theological works, but also vast collections on philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, history, and poetry. Scholars like Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, and Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and physician, both of whom lived in Al-Andalus, relied on such extensive literary resources. Their intellectual output was directly enabled by the rich library culture. Beyond Cordoba, other cities in Al-Andalus, like Seville, Granada, and Toledo, also had significant libraries, both public and private. Wealthy families, scholars, and even ordinary citizens would own substantial collections of books. This widespread literacy and love for books created a dynamic intellectual environment. Scholars from all religious backgrounds engaged in translation projects, bringing Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin texts into a common intellectual discourse. This exchange of ideas was groundbreaking. For example, Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts preserved in Al-Andalus later became crucial for the revival of learning in medieval Europe. The knowledge contained in these libraries was diverse and cutting-edge for its time. Medical texts included detailed anatomical drawings and sophisticated surgical techniques. Astronomical works featured precise calculations and observations. Mathematical treatises introduced concepts like algebra and algorithms, which were revolutionary. Poetry of Al-Andalus was renowned for its lyrical beauty and complexity. Imagine walking through the narrow, winding streets of Cordoba, knowing that behind every ornate door, a scholar might be poring over a rare manuscript or a poet composing verses that would shape the literary landscape. However, the Golden Age of Al-Andalus eventually gave way to political fragmentation and, ultimately, the Christian Reconquista. As Christian kingdoms gradually pushed south, the tolerant intellectual environment began to crumble. The fall of Toledo in 1085 marked a turning point, though it paradoxically became a center for translation where scholars transmitted Arabic knowledge to Latin Europe. But with the increasing intensity of the Reconquista, especially in the 13th century, many of these magnificent libraries faced destruction or dispersal. When cities like Cordoba and Seville fell to Christian forces, their vast collections were often regarded with suspicion by the new rulers. Islamic texts were frequently viewed as heretical or dangerous. While some manuscripts were preserved, many were burned or scattered. The systematic destruction intensified, particularly during periods of religious zeal. The sheer number of books in Al-Andalus meant that total annihilation was difficult, but the unified, thriving intellectual ecosystem that sustained these libraries was shattered. The expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain centuries later also led to further loss and dispersal of private collections. The loss of these libraries was not just about the physical destruction of books. It was about the disruption of a unique intellectual and cultural synthesis. Many unique works of philosophy, science, and literature, particularly those reflecting the cross-cultural exchange of Al-Andalus, were lost. Imagine the intellectual vibrancy of a city like Cordoba at its peak, where a scholar could access texts from Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and across the Islamic world, all within walking distance. This kind of access, before its tragic and violent dispersal, was unparalleled in the medieval West. Number 6. The Abbey Library of Cluny, France. In the heart of medieval France, the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny stood as one of the most influential monastic institutions in Europe. Founded in 910 CE, Cluny became a powerhouse of religious reform and intellectual activity, wielding immense spiritual and political authority. And at the core of its profound influence was its magnificent library, a central repository of knowledge that reflected the abbey's dedication to scholarship and its role in preserving Christian and classical learning. The library at Cluny grew steadily over centuries, acquiring manuscripts through gifts, copying, and purchase. Monks within the abbey were skilled scribes, meticulously copying theological texts, biblical commentaries, patristic writings, and classical literature. Cluniac order was known for its strict observance of the Benedictine rule, which emphasized prayer work and study. The library served as the lifeblood of this scholarly pursuit. Imagine long, quiet reading rooms, illuminated by natural light from high windows, filled with monks poring over heavy parchment volumes. The collection was vast and diverse for a monastic library. It housed the complete works of many church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. It contained important biblical texts, liturgical books, and volumes on canon law. But Cluny's collection was not limited to religious works. It also possessed copies of classical Latin authors, including Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Livy, whose works were carefully preserved and studied. This commitment to classical learning set Cluny apart and made it a significant cultural center. By the 12th century, Cluny's library was considered one of the largest and most comprehensive in Western Europe. It was a treasure trove for scholars and theologians, attracting intellectuals who sought access to its unique holdings. The abbey's scriptorium was highly active, producing beautiful illuminated manuscripts that were masterpieces of medieval art. The process of making a book was incredibly laborious, from preparing the parchment to writing the text, illustrating it, and finally binding it. Each volume represented countless hours of dedicated labor. The architecture of the abbey itself was grand, reflecting its wealth and importance. The abbey church, built in the Romanesque style, was the largest in the world for centuries until the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. The library would have been housed in a dedicated wing, perhaps with intricate wooden shelving and comfortable reading carrels for the monks. The atmosphere would have been one of profound quiet, broken only by the rustle of pages or the soft murmur of contemplation. Collection was systematically organized, though not with the complex indexing systems of Al-Andalus. Nonetheless, monks would have known where to find specific texts, making it a functional and accessible resource for their studies and the production of new knowledge. The library was crucial for the Cluniac reform movement, which aimed to revitalize monastic life and influence the wider church. The theological arguments and legal precedents for their reforms were often drawn directly from the texts preserved within their library. However, the grandeur of Cluny could not protect it from the radical upheaval of later centuries. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, brought about the dissolution of monastic orders and the confiscation of church property. Cluny, once so powerful, was targeted. The abbey was declared national property in 1790, and its vast buildings were systematically dismantled for building materials. The magnificent library, a repository of 1,000 years of scholarship, was largely dispersed and destroyed. Many of the manuscripts were either burned, sold as scrap, or simply taken by individuals who did not understand their value. While some volumes found their way into public libraries, notably the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the cohesive and immense collection of Cluny was shattered. The unique insights, marginalia, and specific editions that formed the library's distinct identity were lost. The destruction of the Cluny Abbey and its library was a profound cultural loss for France and for Europe, symbolizing the violent rupture with the past that the Revolution represented. To have spent a day amidst the quiet learning of Cluny, surrounded by its ancient texts before its violent dispersal, would have been an unparalleled immersion in the heart of medieval Christian scholarship. Number 5. The Library of Glastonbury Abbey, England. Steeped in myth and legend, Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, England, was one of the oldest and most revered monastic sites in Britain. Its origins were shrouded in ancient history, with claims of being founded by Joseph of Arimathea himself, or even by Christ's apostles. By the medieval period, it was a wealthy and powerful Benedictine abbey, attracting pilgrims and scholars from across England and beyond. Central to its prestige and learning was its impressive library, a collection that held not only theological works, but also unique historical chronicles and possibly Arthurian legends that fueled the medieval imagination. The library at Glastonbury was built up over centuries, benefiting from the abbey's vast estates and royal patronage. Monks within the abbey were dedicated scribes and scholars, producing and preserving texts. The abbey's scriptorium was active, creating beautifully illuminated manuscripts. Imagine a quiet, hallowed space within the abbey complex, perhaps a long hall or a series of interconnected chambers, where texts were carefully stored on lecterns and in chests, and later on shelves. The air would have been cool and still, permeated with the scent of aged parchment. The collection was substantial for a medieval English abbey. It included a comprehensive range of theological works, biblical commentaries, lives of saints, and liturgical texts necessary for daily monastic life. But what made Glastonbury's library particularly fascinating was its unique historical holdings. Given the abbey's ancient claims, it was a repository for chronicles and records pertaining to early British history, including possibly some of the earliest written accounts related to the legendary King Arthur. The discovery of what was purported to be King Arthur's grave at Glastonbury in the late 12th century certainly added to the abbey's mystique and its likely collection of related narratives. Scholars like William of Malmesbury, a prominent English historian of the 12th century, spent time at Glastonbury and utilized its library for his historical writings. His Antiquities of Glastonbury draws heavily on the abbey's traditions and possibly its unique collection of historical documents. The library also held texts on natural philosophy, medicine, and classical authors, though the emphasis was clearly on religious and historical scholarship relevant to the abbey's unique place in English history. The monks would have engaged in daily study and contemplation, using the library as their primary resource. They would have copied important texts, preserving them for future generations, and perhaps even composed new works. The library served as a vital intellectual center for the region, and its holdings would have been consulted by other scholars and ecclesiastical figures. To touch a volume within this library would have been to touch a piece of living history to connect with the very roots of British identity and legend. However, the venerable Abbey of Glastonbury, like all monastic institutions in England, faced a devastating end during the reign of King Henry VIII. In the 1530s, Henry embarked on the dissolution of the monasteries, a systematic campaign to seize monastic wealth and suppress religious houses. Glastonbury Abbey, with its immense wealth, lands, and long history, was a prime target. In 1539, the abbey was suppressed. Abbot Richard Whiting, the last abbot of Glastonbury, along with 2 of his monks, was executed on Glastonbury Tor, a nearby hill, for treason after refusing to surrender the abbey's treasures to the king. The abbey buildings were systematically dismantled, their materials sold off. The magnificent library, its contents of immense historical and literary value, was dispersed. Many of the books were simply destroyed, burned, or scattered. Some likely found their way into private hands or other ecclesiastical collections, but the unified and unique collection of Glastonbury was shattered. The loss of its historical chronicles, particularly those related to the Arthurian legends, is deeply felt by historians and literary scholars even today. Imagine the early versions of the tales of King Arthur, his knights, and the search for the Holy Grail, perhaps preserved in their original monastic context within the abbey's walls. These precious texts are now mostly lost, surviving only as later copies or references in other works. The physical destruction of Glastonbury Abbey was total, and its library followed suit. What remains today are atmospheric ruins, hinting at the grandeur that once stood. To have stepped inside that ancient library, to have breathed the same air as the monks who meticulously preserved the legends and histories of Britain, would have been a profound journey into the heart of England's mythical past, a journey now irrevocably lost. Number 4. The libraries of the Knights Templar, Europe, and the Levant. The Knights Templar, a powerful military monastic order founded in 1119 CE, were unlike any other religious order. They were warrior monks dedicated to protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land and fighting in the Crusades. But beyond their martial prowess and immense wealth, the Templars also maintained libraries, repositories of knowledge crucial to their administration, their spiritual life, and possibly even some of the secrets that later fueled legends surrounding them. These libraries were not centralized, like the great imperial or monastic collections, but rather dispersed across their numerous commanderies, castles, and preceptories throughout Europe and the Levant. Each Templar house, whether a grand headquarters in Jerusalem or Paris, or a smaller rural preceptory, would have maintained a collection of texts. These libraries would have been utilitarian, reflecting the order's practical needs. They contained liturgical books for their daily prayers, rules of their order like the Latin rule and the French rule, and theological texts that informed their spiritual life. Imagine a small fortified room within a Templar castle, perhaps dimly lit, housing sturdy bound volumes used by the knights for their spiritual devotions and administrative duties. Beyond the religious texts, the Templars, as a sophisticated military and financial organization, would have possessed extensive archives. These would have included charters, land deeds, financial records, treaties, and correspondence with popes, kings, and other nobles. These administrative documents were essential for managing their vast international network of assets and for their diplomatic activities. Such records, though not traditionally library texts, constituted a crucial body of knowledge about the medieval world that is now largely lost or scattered. The Templars also had significant engagement in the Levant, the Crusader states, where they would have encountered different cultures and learned practical knowledge from the region. It is plausible that their libraries might have contained some texts related to engineering, fortifications, or even some local chronicles and geographical descriptions from the Middle East. While there is no definitive evidence of them possessing vast collections of esoteric or ancient wisdom, as some later legends suggest, their practical needs and extensive international presence hint at a more diverse collection than a typical monastic library. They operated as an early form of international bank, handling large sums of money for pilgrims and kings. This financial complexity would have necessitated detailed record-keeping and possibly texts on accountancy or legal precedents. Their headquarters in Paris, the Temple, was a formidable fortress and financial hub. It is here that one might have found the most substantial collection of Templar documents, and perhaps a more formal library. However, the Templars' immense power and wealth ultimately led to their downfall. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the order, orchestrated their suppression. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Templars across France were arrested on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and various other transgressions. The accusations were largely fabricated and extracted through torture. Following their arrests, Templar properties were seized, their commanderies and castles were plundered. The fate of their libraries and archives was grim. Many documents and books were undoubtedly destroyed in the chaos of confiscation or deliberately burned as part of the effort to erase the order's legacy. Others were dispersed, falling into the hands of the king's agents, or later, the Knights Hospitaller, who inherited some of the Templar properties. The systematic nature of the suppression meant that central collections, if they existed in any significant form, were scattered. While some Templar documents survived and are now found in archives across Europe, providing glimpses into their operations, the vast majority of their internal records, and certainly any significant literary collections, vanished. The loss was not merely intellectual, but also historical, depriving us of detailed insights into one of the most mysterious and powerful organizations of the High Middle Ages. To have seen the inner workings of a Templar commandery, to have accessed their operational records, or perhaps even some unique accounts of their experiences in the Holy Land, would have illuminated much about this enigmatic order. These lost libraries, scattered across a vast geography and destroyed by political machinations, represent a profound gap in our understanding of the Knights Templar and the complex tapestry of medieval power and belief. Number 3. The Library of Monte Cassino, Italy. Perched atop a hill overlooking the town of Cassino in central Italy, the Abbey of Monte Cassino holds a unique place in Western history. It was founded by Saint Benedict himself around 529 CE, establishing the Benedictine order and the very rule that would govern monastic life for centuries. From its inception, Monte Cassino was dedicated to learning, prayer, and manual labor, and its library became one of the most important centers for the preservation of classical and early Christian texts in medieval Europe. The library's history is a testament to resilience, having been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times throughout the centuries. Each rebuilding saw a renewed effort to collect, copy, and preserve manuscripts. Monks at Monte Cassino were renowned for their scribble skills and their dedication to copying ancient texts, both religious and secular. This systematic labor helped transmit vast amounts of classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent early medieval period. Imagine the sound of quill on parchment endlessly reproducing texts that were centuries old. The collection was immense and highly valued. It included a vast array of patristic writings, such as the works of Augustine, Ambrose, and Jerome, alongside complete biblical texts and liturgical books. But crucially, Monte Cassino also preserved many classical Latin authors. The monks copied texts by Horace, Virgil, Livy, Seneca, and Cicero, ensuring their survival. The abbey was particularly famous for its collection of medical texts, including the works of Hippocrates and Galen, which were translated from Greek into Latin, making them accessible to Western physicians. The library was central to the intellectual life of the abbey. Scholars like Paul the Deacon, a Lombard monk and historian of the 8th century, lived and worked at Monte Cassino, contributing to its historical chronicles and utilizing its rich collection for his writings. The abbey's scriptorium was highly active, producing not only copies of ancient works, but also new theological treatises, historical accounts, and legal commentaries. The meticulous nature of their work meant that their copies were often highly accurate and beautifully produced. Throughout the medieval period, Monte Cassino served as a beacon of learning in Italy. It was a place where scholars could consult rare manuscripts and where intellectual traditions were kept alive. The library was organized, with texts carefully cataloged and stored, making it accessible to the monks who spent their lives in study and contemplation. To walk through its halls would have been to witness the living heart of early medieval scholarship, a place where the threads of ancient knowledge were carefully woven into the fabric of Christian Europe. However, its strategic location also made it vulnerable to repeated attacks. The abbey was first sacked by the Lombards in 577 CE, forcing the monks to flee to Rome and taking some of their precious manuscripts with them. It was rebuilt only to be destroyed again by Saracens in 883 CE, leading to another period of dispersal and loss. Yet each time, the Benedictine order persevered, and the library was gradually reconstituted, often with copies of texts that had been saved or new acquisitions. The most recent major destruction of the library occurred much later, during World War II, in February 1944. Allied forces bombed the abbey, believing it was being used by German troops as an observation post. While many of the most valuable manuscripts had been evacuated by the Germans themselves and taken to Rome and the Vatican for safekeeping shortly before the bombing, the abbey building itself and much of its remaining collection were destroyed. The physical shell of the library, the shelves, the reading rooms, the immediate context for centuries of study were reduced to rubble. Although many of its core historical manuscripts were saved in the 20th century, the repeated historical destructions in the medieval period meant that certain texts, particularly those from its earliest collections, were lost forever. The disruption of its continuous scholarly work and the irreplaceable context of its historical holdings cannot be fully recovered. Visiting Monte Cassino during one of its medieval peaks, before the numerous waves of destruction, would have been to witness a living tradition of scholarship, a direct link to the very roots of the Western intellectual tradition. Sustained through immense perseverance against the odds. Number 2. The Royal Library of Buddha. Bibliotheca Corviniana, Hungary. In the late 15th century, during the twilight of the medieval era and the dawn of the Renaissance, the city of Buda in Hungary became a vibrant intellectual and artistic center. This was largely due to the patronage of King Matthias Corvinus, who reigned from 1458 to 1490. True Renaissance prince. Matthias was a passionate collector of books and a dedicated patron of the arts and sciences. His creation, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, was one of the largest and most magnificent libraries of its time, rivaling even the Vatican Library in its splendor and scope. Matthias Corvinus invested vast resources in his library. He employed a permanent staff of scribes, illuminators, and binders who worked in his palace scriptorium, producing exquisitely crafted codices. He also sent agents across Italy and Europe to acquire rare manuscripts, both ancient and contemporary. The library was meticulously organized and housed in a grand hall within the royal palace in Buda, designed to showcase the beauty of the books themselves. Imagine walls lined with beautifully crafted wooden shelves, holding thousands of volumes bound in red leather, often adorned with Matthias's raven emblem, the corvus. The collection of the Corviniana was exceptionally diverse, contained not only theological works but also classical Greek and Latin authors, many of which were still rare in Europe. Matthias's humanistic interests meant the library included texts on philosophy, history, geography, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. He collected works by Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, and Euclid, alongside contemporary Renaissance humanist writings by figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. The library was a bridge between the classical world and the emerging Renaissance. The manuscripts themselves were works of art. Corvinian codices are famous for their intricate illuminations, vibrant colors, and elegant calligraphy. Many were commissioned from the finest workshops in Florence and Buda. These books were not just for reading. They were symbols of the king's intellectual ambition and his embrace of Renaissance ideals. To hold one of these books would have been to hold a masterpiece of craftsmanship and scholarship. Scholars and humanists from across Europe visited Buda to consult the library and engage in intellectual discourse with the king and his court. The library was a reflection of King Matthias's vision for Hungary, a powerful kingdom at the crossroads of East and West, a center of learning and culture. It was a place where knowledge was revered and actively pursued. The influence of the Corviniana extended far beyond Hungary's borders, demonstrating the intellectual sophistication of the kingdom and inspiring other rulers to develop their own collections. However, the magnificent Royal Library of Buda met a tragic fate within decades of its founder's death. Following the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans marched on Buda. In 1541, after years of fluctuating control, Buda fell decisively to the Ottoman forces. The conquest of Buda led to the dispersal and destruction of the Corviniana. Many of the books were either systematically plundered by the Ottoman soldiers, scattered, or destroyed in the chaos of the siege and subsequent occupation. While some Corvinian codices found their way into the Ottoman Imperial Library in Constantinople, and others were dispersed across Europe, the vast majority of the collection was lost as a coherent entity. Accounts suggest that many books were simply thrown out or used as fuel. The loss was immense. An estimated 650 to 2,000 volumes out of a collection that may have once numbered 3,000 to 5,000 are known to have survived and are now scattered in libraries and museums worldwide. The unique combination of classical, humanist, and scientific texts, beautifully rendered and meticulously collected, was shattered. Imagine walking through the grand hall of the Buda Palace, surrounded by the vibrant colors of illuminated manuscripts before the destructive sweep of imperial conquest. This incredible beacon of Renaissance learning, a symbol of royal patronage and intellectual ambition, was reduced to fragments by the tides of war, leaving behind a profound longing for what once was. Number 1. The libraries of the Cathars, southern France. Our final lost libraries are perhaps the most ephemeral, existing not as grand central institutions, but as scattered precious collections within a persecuted community. Cathars were a dualist religious movement that flourished in southern France, particularly in the Languedoc region, from the 11th to the 13th centuries. They held beliefs that differed significantly from the mainstream Catholic Church, seeing the material world as evil and emphasizing spiritual purity, asceticism, and a direct relationship with God. This distinct theology was codified in texts that formed the basis of their spiritual lives. And these texts, their libraries, were systematically hunted down and destroyed. The Cathar communities were often self-sufficient, and their spiritual leaders, the prefects or prefectae, were highly learned individuals. They would have possessed copies of their unique scriptures, theological treatises, and commentaries that explained their dualist doctrines. Unlike the grand monastic or imperial libraries, these would have been smaller, perhaps more humble collections, often hidden away in private homes or secret gathering places. Imagine a small, carefully guarded room in a simple house where a few precious manuscripts, written on parchment or even paper, were kept, representing the entire spiritual heritage of a community. The core texts of Catharism were unique to their faith. They believed in a good God who created the spiritual realm, and an evil God who created the material world. Their interpretation of the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of John, was distinct. They also had their own prayers and rituals, such as the consolamentum, a spiritual baptism that initiated individuals into the perfects. These practices and beliefs would have been documented in their sacred texts. The most famous Cathar text was likely their own version of the New Testament, or specific commentaries on it, along with didactic works explaining their cosmology and ethics. Cathars were a highly literate community, and their prefects were dedicated to teaching and preaching. This meant that the creation and dissemination of their texts were vital. Scribes within the community would have carefully copied these works, ensuring their spread among believers. The books would have been handled with reverence, not just as sources of knowledge, but as tangible connections to their spiritual truth. They were a lifeline for a community that saw itself as living outside the established order. The lifestyle of the prefects was austere. They abstained from meat, lived simply, and traveled to preach and minister to their communities. Their reliance on direct teaching and the personal circulation of texts meant that their libraries were fluid and decentralized. These were not public institutions, but rather vital, private collections, passed down and protected with immense care due to their profound spiritual significance. However, the independent and unorthodox nature of Catharism was seen as a grave threat by the Catholic Church. From the late 12th century, the Church launched a series of crusades and inquisitions against the Cathars, known as the Albigensian Crusade, beginning in 1209. This was a brutal and systematic campaign to eradicate Catharism, which included the deliberate destruction of their texts. The Inquisition, specifically established in the 13th century to root out heresy, placed a high priority on finding and burning Cathar books. Possessing Cathar texts was itself considered evidence of heresy and punishable by severe penalties, including death. Inquisitors would raid homes, search hiding places, and interrogate suspects about the whereabouts of these forbidden books. Imagine the terror of hiding a precious spiritual text, knowing that its discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. The systematic destruction was highly effective. Many Cathar texts were confiscated and publicly burned, often alongside their owners. The goal was total annihilation of their intellectual and spiritual heritage. As a result, Very few authentic Cathar texts survived the Inquisition. What we know about Cathar beliefs often comes from the writings of their Catholic opponents, who summarized their doctrines in order to refute them, or from the records of the Inquisition itself. The loss of the Cathar libraries represents a unique historical tragedy. It is not the loss of a grand public institution, but the targeted elimination of an entire spiritual literature. We are deprived of direct insights into the rich theological and philosophical world of the Cathars, their nuanced interpretations of Scripture, and their unique understanding of existence. To have accessed one of these hidden collections, to have read a Cathar gospel or a book of their unique prayers, would have been to step into a forbidden world of faith and resistance, a world that was deliberately and violently erased from the historical record, leaving behind only tantalizing hints and profound silence.